Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dsouza. I am one of the editors of the Current Legal Problems lecture series and journal, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Current Legal Problems lecture. I will be chairing tonight's lecture. The lecture is by Professor Tendayi Achiume of Stanford University, and it is on the topic of corporate borders. Professor Achiume is an international legal scholar focusing on international human rights law, international refugee law, and international migration law. Her academic research explores the global governance of racism and xenophobia and the legal and ethical implications of colonialism and other forms of empire for the governance of international migration. In recognition of her exceptional creativity and promise for important future advance, Professor Achiume's research in these areas, um, Professor Achiume's research in these areas, she was awarded a 2023 MacArthur Fellowship. And in addition to her post at Stanford, Professor Achiume is also an extraordinary professor in the Department of Jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria. She's also a research associate with the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand and a research associate with the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. She is also, this list goes on, a former United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and she was the first woman to serve in this role since its creation in 1993. For this academic year, she has just moved all the way across the United States to take up a position as a scholar in residence at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. So, Professor Achiume, it's an absolute pleasure to have you deliver today's lecture. Before I ask Professor Achiume to deliver her lecture, I want to say a little bit about the format of today's event. So Professor Achiume will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes. And at any time while she is speaking, you can post a question into the Q&A forum, which you should see at the bottom of your screens. After she's finished speaking, I will put your questions to Professor Achiume, possibly after grouping connected questions. That way, I'll try to get through as many of your questions as is possible within the 1 hour or so that we have together in total. And with that, Professor Achiume, you're the person that people want to hear, so I will slink off into the background and join everyone else in listening to you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that very generous invitation to participate in this esteemed lecture series. I regret not being able to be there in person, not least because there are so many people at UCL who I would be excited to engage with, including my good friend, Ralph Wild. Ralph, thanks for being in the audience. Wish I could see you in person, and whose work actually is very inspiring to my own, both his academic work and his work as a legal practitioner. So it's just to say that I regret not being there in person, but I also appreciate your willingness to accommodate me remotely. So I'm joining you from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where I'm a member for the year. And as you'll learn shortly, my presentation concerns, among other things, imperial domination, settler colonialism, and forcible displacement. And so it's especially important, I think, for me to acknowledge that the place where I am currently is situated on the land that is the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people who were displaced by violent colonial actions that forced their relocation to the north and to the west. So let me figure out how to share my slides before I get started. And give me one moment. All right. Can you see the first slide? Yes. Okay. Lovely. And if for any reason you can't see them, please, Mark, let me know through the chat. Okay. So my presentation today is entitled Corporate Borders, and the work that I'm presenting to you today introduces themes that are at the heart of a book project that I'm developing while here at the Institute. And what I thought I would do before jumping into the project itself was to give you a little bit of background on the work that I do, and then introduce corporate borders before turning to some of the normative implications of the project that I'm going to be presenting to you. And so here's an outline just giving you a sense of where we're going to be going. So the focus of my scholarship is on the global governance of racism, xenophobia, and migration. And in this work, I consider the ways that colonialism was constitutive of the applicable international legal frameworks, and also of how colonial legacies persist and remain deeply embedded in the doctrine of international law. In this regard, my work is in the TWAIL tradition, the Third World Approaches to International Law, which is a broad post-colonial tent that takes seriously as a starting point, as I mentioned, that the foundations of the doctrine of contemporary international law originate in the project of European colonial domination, and that making sense of international law in the present actually requires reckoning with this imperial genealogy. My past work has focused on borders and the rights of nation states to exclude non-nationals, which is an incident of state sovereignty. And I'm not going to assume that everybody in the audience is an international lawyer or even a lawyer, so I'll say a little bit about what the doctrine of state sovereignty is in international law, but it's basically the understanding that all states in the international order are equal and independent, and that states have an almost absolute right to exclude non-nationals from their territorial borders. And the legal justifications for this reflect and rely upon liberal nationalist commitments relating to the collective self-determination of the nation. So against this doctrinal account, I've argued that on the basis of the way that international law and international legal institutions keep formerly colonized nations politically and economically bound to their former colonizers, liberal democratic theory instead supports a conception of state sovereignty that is quite different from what we see in international law. So rather than thinking of states as independent and autonomous, we have to take seriously persisting interconnection among states in the international order. And when we take this interconnection seriously, I argue that at least from an ethical perspective, we should understand former colonial powers as actually not having the right to exclude citizens from formerly colonized nations. And this is an argument that I make in a paper called Migration as Decolonization, in which I argue, for example, that the United Kingdom has no right to exclude, at least from an ethical perspective, citizens of its former colonies from its nation-state borders, and that we should actually be thinking about movement of so-called economic migrants from formerly colonized nations to former colonial powers as anti-colonial in some sense, as in effect a response and a challenge to neo-colonial domination that warrants legal protection. And so in that work, I push at minimum that we should think about reorienting legal frameworks to better recognize this reality, even as we strive more broadly for meaningful border justice. More recently, my work has focused on the racial nature of contemporary international legal borders and the applicable legal frameworks, which too cannot be divorced from their colonial past. And to illustrate some of the arguments that I've made and to understand their relevance, it's helpful to highlight two incidents that some of you may be familiar with because you remember when they occurred. So this slide that you're seeing now is an image from a funeral in 2017, November 2017, that was held in Italy after media outlets reported the death of 26 Nigerian girls and women aged between 14 and 18. Whose bodies were found floating in the Mediterranean. And there were many more individuals on the boat that carried them, including some survivors who explained that the motivation of these Nigerian women was the search for jobs in Europe. You may also recall on June 24, 2022, Moroccan and Spanish border guards killed between 23 and 37 African men as they and a group of others attempted an authorized crossing of Morocco's land border with Spain in Melilla. And that slide that I'm showing you is from that border crossing. And many others were injured apart from the people who died, and the video images of the violence and its aftermath were really difficult to watch. You had bodies of living injured people and dead persons piled on top of one another as border guards kicked and prodded them to ensure that they were subdued. And this was I remember receiving reports and evidence from this incident when I was in my role as special rapporteur. And I've picked two examples, but these instances, these circumstances are so commonplace that, I could have picked thousands more to just articulate the nature of border violence. And here I'm focusing on Europe's borders with the rest of with Africa and other parts of the world. But you can think of examples from other regions as well, including from the US's border with Mexico in the south. And until quite recently, even in the present mainstream legal and judicial accounts of even the most violent border encounters have typically been devoid of any racial critique. And yet it's neither arbitrary nor coincidental that the 26 women who perished were Black, and the same is true of the people who perished at the Malia border in the slide that you are seeing. And in effect, Europe's borders are racial borders, as Nicholas de Genova has observed. In my work, I've argued that international borders writ large, so the borders of our international order, wherever you might be, are racial borders, and that the seemingly race-neutral legal regimes that govern migration, including the international human rights and refugee law frameworks that sustain migration and mobility, do so on a racial basis, and that race itself remains crucial border infrastructure. These are arguments that I make in a paper called Racial Borders, in which I really try and dig deep into thinking about persisting racialized forms of domination that exist in migration frameworks that we international lawyers tend to treat as neutral. And so thinking of borders as imperial technology and as a means of racial governance. And so in this work, as you can tell from the way that I've been describing it, my focus has been on nation states, and it's been on nation state responsibility and thinking about how imperialism and legacies of imperialism should structure understandings of justice at the border and what the legal frameworks need to look like. And part of the focus on the nation state is driven by the fact that in international law, it's states that are the subjects of international law. They are the only ones that have subjectivity, states and the international organizations that they form. But other entities are not considered subjects of international law, which lends itself to a kind of methodological nationalism or nation state focus. So I want to shift to corporate borders, which is the project that I'm going to be discussing for the remainder of my time with you. And in this project, what I'm trying to do is explore nation state and specifically corporate control and constitution of international migration and nation state borders. And I use the concept of corporate borders to trouble traditional ways of thinking about border and migration justice. Central to my exploration is the ways in which transnational corporations, colonial and contemporary, have made and used borders and race together as technologies of economic profit. And for the presentation today, I'm going to set aside a crystallized engagement or discussion of the racial dimensions or the race theory dimensions of this project. I'm happy to reflect on them for Q&A, but my presentation won't necessarily emphasize those dimensions because otherwise it may take us too much time. But the current hypothesis that I'm working with is that it's analytically useful and maybe even urgent for legal scholars and scholars of borders and migration more broadly to develop an account of corporate borders, and I'm calling what my loose definition of corporate borders is that it's the facets of international borders that are materially determined by transnational corporations or that are otherwise tailored to benefit transnational corporations and the elites that control them. And I should say a word here, which is to say that there is a really illuminating and important literature in international migration legal scholarship that focuses on the privatization of immigration enforcement, that focuses on the migration industry. And this work is very important and influential for the arguments that I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to do is push beyond thinking about corporate influence and even just privatization as something that is influencing migration and borders, to actually thinking about the transnational corporation as an entity or a networked entity that is determining and constituting the borders in a more fundamental way. Okay, what do I mean by international borders? So at a minimum, I'm referring to the geographic boundaries of the nation state. So when you look at a map, I'm referring to the borders that you see, the geographic demarcations that set apart the different nation states that we associate with the international order. But I'm also thinking about legal and political institutions that determine the terms and the bounds of national membership and that shape and govern interconnection among different national jurisdictions. So I'm thinking here of sovereignty, I'm thinking about citizenship, nationality, race. These are all legal and political institutions that I think of as border institutions that are relevant for how we think about what the international border is. So moving away from the static conception to also think about the legal and political architecture that gives meaning to borders is something that I'm interested in. And I'm especially interested in the study of borders and their relationship to individual and collective self-determination. So in trying to excavate a conception of corporate borders, I'm interested in how they might impact self-determination as well. In this project, I'm thinking through jurisdiction as well and its relationship to borders. And in international law, jurisdiction is, this is very roughly speaking, you could have a whole lecture on the meaning of jurisdiction and still not get to the bottom of it. But at a minimum in international law, jurisdiction is the authority of the state over persons, places, or events. And the bases for jurisdiction are determined primarily by territory, which is geographically delimited by borders, but also by nationality. And there's other bases for jurisdiction. There's universal jurisdiction. There's a bunch of other exceptions. But for my purposes, it's enough to highlight territory and nationality as being the basis of jurisdiction because it highlights the role that borders are playing, even in shaping what jurisdiction is. For the individual, jurisdiction determines your rights, your responsibilities, your liabilities, and how you live almost every aspect of your life. And you can think, for example, about the difference in this world that is made between holding a US passport or an Afghan passport or a passport issued by the Palestinian Authority. A passport is effectively a jurisdictional determination, and it's one example of how much of the decisions that you make can be shaped, or the zone of decision making can be shaped by jurisdiction. For the political collective, national or domestic jurisdiction is the zone of sovereign expression and articulation, and domestic jurisdiction is shielded from international law and from foreign interference. And in this sense, I think it defines what we think of as the sovereignty of the nation state. So mapping corporate borders, to my mind, entails mapping the extent to which and the means through which corporations materially shape and leverage geographic boundaries of the nation state, the legal and political institutions, and the national jurisdictions they construct and they connect. And so I'm thinking that in tracing these corporate borders, I'm tracing something that's quite material to self-determination and also to imperial domination, which often can be thought of as, among other things, being about domination of some collectives, some political collectives over others. So borders and jurisdiction are the domain of state determination. I'm interested in how corporations, and especially transnational corporations, exercise what international law has regulated as sovereign functions in relation to borders, and how through border institutions, corporations shape and determine national jurisdictions and self-determination within them, with a particular focus on third world peoples. Okay, so let me turn to some examples that I hope will help concretize what I am talking about. In an ethnography entitled Zimbabwe's Migrants in South Africa's Border Farms, Maxim Bolt evocatively describes the borderlands between Zimbabwe and South Africa, specifically the border at South Africa's northernmost point. Here, the Limpopo River separates the two countries along with an electric fence. The electric fence isn't pictured in this image, but this is an image from the Limpopo River. And the electric fence that exists in some parts of this border region was actually erected during what Maxim Bolt describes as the border war of apartheid's twilight, highlighting that the South African apartheid regime actually had very concrete manifestations at the national border, even in terms of the border infrastructure that exists to the present. And so the scene that Bolt describes as taking place on the South African side of the border, which is populated by white-owned farms where tomatoes, cotton and citrus fruits are growing in a rather dry and almost quite desert landscape that doubles, I would say, as a graveyard for undocumented migrants who are unsuccessfully who are unsuccessful in their attempts to make it from the Zimbabwean side to South Africa's interior. But those who are able to make it, some of them, we find Black Zimbabwean farm workers who work on white-owned South African farms growing, and here pictured here, growing oranges that ensure year-round availability in Europe, for example. In his book, Bolt focuses on a scene in 2008 on one of the farms along this border, where recruitment of farm workers for the harvest was in progress one early morning, and over which the white farmer and his Black foreman and team of workers presided. Also present on the farm was a crowd of job seekers who were undocumented Black Zimbabweans who had received the details of the recruitment from the usual cross-border networks. And also present at this scene was South African soldiers who are typically stationed along the border and responsible for its enforcement. The foreman had a list of 210 names of those among the crowd whom the farm had selected for employment. Prior to the names being made public, the entire crowd of undocumented Zimbabweans were neither illegal border jumpers nor lawfully present farm workers. At this stage, the soldiers had no idea who fell into which category, and they even assisted in maintaining crowd order as this group eagerly awaited the reading of the list. After the foreman read out the list of names, however, Bolt observed, and I quote, that the line between workers and border jumpers had been drawn, and those left in the crowd were simply illegals, incongruously arrayed in front of the South African military patrol, end quote. And so those Zimbabweans who were not on the list began running, and then Bolt describes how the army personnel gave chase in order to enforce the border that had been materialized or articulated by the farm. Now, migration from Zimbabwe to South Africa receives a lot of attention domestically in South Africa and in the region, sometimes even internationally. And the contestation of this migration is most manifest, I would argue, in xenophobic backlash against Black Zimbabweans and other non-white so-called economic migrants to whom border dysfunction and national poverty and other things are attributed. Migrants' rights activists, including in litigation and involved in law reform policymaking contexts, focus in on the South African state and its liability, and there are very good reasons to do so. But I think the framing of the problem and also the current ways we think about solutions in this context tend to elide the role of the transnational corporation in articulating and materializing the border. And so what I have in mind here is thinking through how presence on the list is what makes you lawful or unlawful, and that this is a business decision or decision that's made by a corporation. And there's a very real sense in which the farm as a corporate entity is the effective sovereign. And this is something this is a thread that Bolt pulls through in his book as well. It wields the sort of authority that we associate with sovereign control and to which sovereign responsibility attaches. And I would say that this border situation that I've described makes vivid an arguably more general dynamic or proposition that's entailed by corporate control and influence of different forms of labor migration and status through visa regimes, especially agricultural visa regimes as well. But it's not only in the context of agriculture and work visas that we see this kind of border articulation or border materialization on the part of transnational corporations taking place. And I want to give another example very briefly that's from a completely different context. This is an example from the US-Mexico border. Where in the last year or two, there's been the introduction of the CBP One app, It's actually more than a year old. And basically, what the CBP1 app is, it's become the only way for people who are arriving at the US-Mexico border who are seeking asylum at that port of entry to access an asylum claim, or to register, to make an appointment for an asylum claim. And so if you are at that border, the border is first presented to you in this app that you have to have a smartphone in order to download and then use. When the app was introduced and when it was being rolled out, there were very troubling reports by people working in this border region who were talking about how the facial recognition software associated with this app. So you have to have, you have to have your biometrics, some of your biometrics collected by the app, including an image of your face. The facial recognition software was having trouble recognizing Black and brown faces. And if your face is unable to be recognized, you're unable to lodge an appointment claim. It means you're basically unable to lodge an asylum claim. And for those individuals, the border becomes the app in a very real way. The border is materialized or articulated by the app, which is controlled by a private corporation, a tech company that creates and designs it. And I'm happy to talk in Q&A more about sort of the relationship between technology companies, race, and border control. But this is another example of where you see, I would argue, a corporation actually materializing the border for individuals who are subject to the regimes that place corporations in these positions, in these privileged positions. So to continue with the example from the Zimbabwe-South Africa border, Zimbabwe's very existence as a post-colonial nation state and the nature of its borders are of corporate origin. In 1895, this territory was named Rhodesia after Cecil John Rhodes, whose company, the British South Africa Company, colonized and ruled it until the early 1920s, when Rhodesia was transitioned from company rule to a white self-governing colony within the British Empire. And the genealogy of Zimbabwe's borders reveals a case where the corporation actually created and established the eventual national borders. And this I'm thinking about as the delimitation of the international border. And if there's historians in the audience or people who general are familiar with imperial history, you'll know that there are many colonial corporations that played this role of actually delimiting borders, even though here I'm talking about the British South Africa Company. And so in this project, one of the things I'm interested in exploring more deeply is the role that the British South Africa Company played and other subsequent corporations, colonial corporations, neo-colonial corporations, in shaping property regimes and allocations in Zimbabwe and protecting them through rights acquired through corporate nationality and corporate citizenship as well. This is work that would build off of the work of Dina Dsouza, who gave a lecture in this wonderful series as well in the past. And one of the questions I'm interested in pursuing is if we can articulate the role of colonial corporations in colonial and neo-colonial displacement, what might this mean, for example, for demands for reparations in the present from these corporations when we think about ongoing border injustice and border dysfunction? So in thinking about the role of corporations in delimiting international borders, it's not merely a story about setting the geographic bounds or boundaries, but also about shaping what those boundaries mean and shaping what those borders mean. And the work of, for example, historian Francis Musoni, who's published a very careful study of the ways in which the British South Africa Company fundamentally contributed to regional mobility of Africans in the region, and who played a very important role actually in shaping the meaning of in unlawful immigration in the region through processes of lawmaking, law evading. I think what we see in this example, again, is not just the creation of the border, but also what it means to be illegal, who can move and on what terms, is something that's worth considering. In terms of delimiting international borders, there's a related function that I believe transnational corporations are playing and that warrants closer attention, which involves delimiting jurisdictions altogether. And here I'll just mention very briefly the example of Prospera, which is a semi-autonomous jurisdiction, a zone for employment and economic development that was created on an island in Honduras. It's basically a private for-profit city in Honduras that's established by a U.S. corporation backed by some U.S. Tech billionaires. And essentially, this private island operates autonomous from the jurisdiction of the Honduran government, and as a result is able to do many sorts of things, including attracting biotechnology companies that are not subject, US biotechnology companies that are not subject to US regulation, FDA rules, to engage in forms of experimentation that would be prohibited in other jurisdictions and things like that. And an attempt recently by the Honduran government to actually withdraw the semi-autonomous jurisdiction status for Prospera has resulted in the corporation triggering an international arbitration in the ICSID forum, challenging the sovereign decision of the Honduras government to withdraw the authorization for this jurisdiction. And so you have, I think, in this case, delimiting of jurisdiction by a transnational corporation in ways that involve switching between almost a quasi-corporate sovereign status and then also a kind of super legal person or super citizen status. And I'm interested in tracking the legal regimes that are essentially constructing the border and its meaning outside of the zones that migration scholars such as myself typically think about borders as residing. So in the interests of time, I'm going to move you to this slide, which has a sort of summary of the key dimensions of corporate borders that I'm currently pursuing. So articulating and materializing the international border, and that was the first example that I gave you. Delimiting the international border and even delimiting jurisdictions is the other point that I was making. And I want to say a word about jurisdictional arbitrage more broadly and jurisdictional engineering, coming back again to the example of the Zimbabwe-South Africa border that I began with. So these, the survival of these border farms, as Maxim Bolt points out, essentially depends on sales in the international market economy. And as Bolt points out, the murky legal status of the individuals who work on this farm functions as a malleable and cheap solution with workers easily controlled because of their gray status. And what you see is that the border and the differential economic and political and legal jurisdictions it demarcates and protects are critical technologies without which this gray status would be impossible. And essentially, generating corporate profits is about leveraging the differences that borders create and sustain between different jurisdictions. When we bring into focus the historical role of colonial corporations in determining the meaning of illegal migration that I mentioned earlier, we see that contemporary profits gained from ongoing jurisdictional arbitrage, to which the illegality of migration is central, these contemporary practices are a form, I would argue, of persisting border coloniality. Some of the farms along the South African border today are themselves the product of cross-border migration of white Rhodesians who fled Black rule in the early 80s, coming into South Africa, sometimes illegally transporting their farming equipment across the border despite prohibitions by the newly independent Zimbabwean government. And rather than remain in post-colonial Zimbabwe, these farms transported these racially secured colonial spoils. And here I'm referencing the work of Nadine El-Nani, who's talked about the role that immigration plays in protecting colonial spoils. You see them being moved across the border to apartheid South Africa, a jurisdiction at that time that remained subject to formal racial rule. And so you have these South African corporations, some of which are owned by former white Rhodesians who cross national borders and are able to continue to rely on Black Zimbabwean labor thanks to this national border. Think also now about how these these so-called economic migrants, the Zimbabwean ones who are crossing to work on this farm, would have no chances of accessing Europe. And you might think about the slides that I showed you earlier of the people, Africans who are dying in the Mediterranean, and who would be unable to travel to Europe and enjoy the fruits of their labor. They can't go and have the orange that they were so instrumental in helping grow, whereas the corporation that is benefiting from their labor can and does move through the border regions between Zimbabwe and Europe with astounding facility. It's this type of point that I'm interested in exploring as a complement to the traditional ways that I and others have typically thought about about how we articulate border justice. So I have one other example of jurisdictional arbitrage that I was hoping to get into, but in the interests of time, I think what I might do is just say a little bit about the normative implications, some of the normative implications that I've been hinting at, but have not been especially explicit about. One of my central motivations for this project, as I mentioned, is about situating transnational corporations within a broader framework for thinking about border justice. And so, in other words, if the goal is the pursuit of international borders, is the pursuit of just international borders and migration, what are the appropriate demands we might make of transnational corporations in light of their role in border injustice, especially racialized border injustice? And at least one current I'm pushing back against is the tendency to associate corporate influence with more just immigration or more just border outcomes, especially in the policy realm. So one pillar of the Biden administration here in the US's strategy for tackling root causes of migration relies on incentivizing corporate investment and intervention in Central America, when US corporate intervention has been actually among the root causes of displacement in Central American displacement in the first place. And this logic of framing transnational corporations as being a solution rather than a part of the problem of border dysfunction is echoed in global migration policy regimes as well, most vividly perhaps in the 2018 Global Compact on Migration, which is the first international agreement governing migration globally as well. In this document, corporations are conceptualized and presented as instrumental to helping problems of solving displacement, and private sector investment and development is considered to be one of the ways in which the nation states can promote more just regimes. At least that's the image that we see emerging in the Global Compact of Migration. I think that deepening our analytical and theoretical understanding of the role and nature of corporate borders in producing border dysfunction may make it easier to move towards legal frameworks that demand accountability from international corporations, rather than rewarding them for their predatory proclivities. And you can think about the context, for example, of the global ecological crisis that's currently underway full throttle, and that's rooted in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. 90 transnational corporations, predominantly headquartered in the global north, are responsible for 63% of cumulative industrial emissions between 1751 and 2010. And the operations of these transnational corporations have and continue to contribute significantly to the scale of climate-induced international displacement. Yet robust demands for reparatory justice for those who are displaced and will be displaced in the future, and even mitigation efforts to curb future displacement in those discussions, transnational corporations are largely absent from global debates on being held accountable for climate-induced displacement as well. And so I think that having a sharper conception of the role of transnational corporations in shaping borders, in shaping border injustice, might allow us to have a sharper understanding, critique, make sharper demands for how they should also be part of the conversations for dealing with the fallout of the regimes that they are a part of creating. So I will stop here. look forward to Q&A, and hopefully in Q&A can interweave a few more examples that I think help illustrate what I am trying to get at in this project. Thank you so much for your attention.